Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. On December 3rd, the National Housing Conference hosted our annual Solutions for Affordable Housing convening at the National Press Club. We were joined by nearly 350 housing leaders from across the country to discuss tangible, impactful, and achievable solutions to the nation's most critical housing challenges. In today's episode, we revisit the panel, Ending Homelessness, Successful Strategies for Sustainable Results, where experts discussed the evolving dialogue on homelessness, the practices that work, and the opportunities to strengthen support systems. The conversation highlights how aligning goals and strategies can improve responses for individuals and families at risk of or experiencing homelessness. To view the conversation in its entirety and other sessions from the Solutions for Affordable Housing Conference, visit nhc.org.
It's good to see all of you. Thank you for being here. The after lunch slump is real for me, but I hope that we have some really interesting things for you. I'm Kathryn Monet. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans and one of the members of the NHC Board of Governors. So I'm really excited to see so many people here. You can sit in the front if you want to. It's okay. We like you. So one of the things that I love the most about NHC, right, is the ability to bring some of the things that I'm most passionate about forward to kind of thread the needle, right, between my day-to-day and the broader housing development world. And so I'm really excited for today's discussion because, you know, we have seen some big changes in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness and numbers of veterans experiencing homelessness. And quite frankly, I spend a lot of my time focusing most on veterans, but I'm excited to zoom the aperture out some. And I think you all have been here all day and you've heard that there are some changes, right, in the way that the federal government is thinking about homelessness and housing generally. So today we're joined by a panel of experts here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and then we'll dive in for questions. It's a conversation thing. So maybe Julia, if you can go first.
Julia Lightfoot. I'm the executive director and founder of Clean and Sober Streets, a drug and alcohol rehab here in Washington, D.C.
I'm Neal Rackleff. I'm the COO and Executive VP of the Houston Housing Authority. For about the past 30 years, I've been involved in affordable housing development and efforts to reduce homelessness. Was formerly the housing director for the city of Houston and an assistant secretary at HUD over CPD.
Good afternoon. I'm Tramecia, Garner. I work out in San Francisco with an agency called Swords to Plowshares. I'm the executive director there. And we focus on serving veterans or folks who've served in the United States military. We've been around for about 50 years doing this work, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at that. And yeah, so that's what I do in my day-to-day work.
So, you know, I think I started a little bit this afternoon. Time is an artificial construct. But I started by talking about some changes, right, to the way the federal government is thinking about programming for homelessness. And I'm curious if you all could tell us a little bit about what types of programs you have in your community or that you're running to give folks in the room kind of a baseline in terms of what the different kinds of programs are out there.
Sure, so I can start. So out in San Francisco, we typically operate quite a bit of wraparound services. So we work with veterans around legal supports in terms of connecting them to VA healthcare, monetary benefits through the VA. We operate permanent supportive housing. We operate a safe haven program as well. We also do mental health work, policy work, employment and training type work. So we try to be full service for veterans in the Bay Area and beyond. And also doing some other work around like back rent assistance through the Support Services for Veterans program that the VA funds. So quite a bit of direct service work for veterans. And we try to also do some work around, especially in our permanent supportive housing, around aging veterans, because that is a huge population of folks that we serve. So folks who are in that Vietnam era cohort, so they're in their 70s. And how do we help them age in place and actually remain housed in a dignified manner? Because typically the folks that we serve are extremely low income, so they cannot afford that next layer of boarding care type support. And where I work, that actually does not exist typically. So there is a lack of affordable long-term care options for veterans in the Bay Area, unless they're willing to go to what we call a veterans home. And a lot of folks, as probably many of us, you don't want to leave your community. So when you think about having to move miles away from where you are, that sometimes is a non-starter for folks. So how do we keep those folks in housing in the safest manner possible?
Houston has had a tremendous amount of success in reducing homelessness and preventing homelessness. So I'd say a little over 10 years ago, there were approximately 10,000 people experiencing homelessness in the Houston metro area. And the last point in time count indicated that we had 3,325 people experiencing homelessness. When I was the housing director of the city of Houston from 2011 to about 16, and we saw a very sharp reduction in chronic homelessness, about 73% in a 3-year period. And I think we were the first major city to effectively eliminate or hit steady state on veterans homelessness. And it was a real coordinated effort with everybody. So, we used a lot of different methodologies. Much of it was moving folks who are chronically homeless right into apartments, right? That was the main methodology that we employed. And we did a lot to coordinate our systems, to build a pipeline of new housing, et cetera. But it's interesting because we're getting to a point now where we're dealing with a harder to serve population amongst our chronically homeless folks. So, for example, some of the folks that have been in this realm the whole time, I was out for a while and I'm just jumping back in, were telling me that a few years ago when we would approach folks who were chronically homeless on the street and offer to get them into an apartment, 70 to 80% of the folks would say yes. Now we're down to a point where 20%-ish are saying yes. And a lot of the individuals that we have, we're kind of, one of the folks in the ecosystem said we're a little bit victims of our own success because we've reduced that population. And we've got a group that's harder to serve and that have, many of whom have really severe mental illness problems and are more prone to crime. One homeless service provider who's provided great housing for veterans for decades was telling me, he said, Neal, we're getting a clientele we haven't experienced before. He said, we had 3 murders in one of our properties, within the last 6 months, murders. He said, we've never had that before. And he was freaked out, right? So we also have a new mayor who has come in and said, people were patting Houston on the back a lot saying how great we're doing, but he correctly said, we're undercounting in many respects. You can't qualify as chronically homeless until you've been homeless for at least a year, right? Well, we had a lot of people living on the streets who didn't meet that definition. And we had to make hard choices previously with limited resources, so we didn't try to fix everything. But our new mayor has said we need some new tools. And so the city has passed a civility ordinance, which I think is a compassionate kind of civility ordinance. And I used to be in the camp of don't ever criminalize homelessness in any manner. And I don't think we should criminalize it. But sometimes law enforcement can compassionately work with service providers and within a coordinated system to help. And the city has gotten recent legislation passed that makes it a little bit easier to get serious medical attention for people who are very severely mentally ill that have just been left to wander the streets. So we're undergoing this change right now in a direction that a lot of us haven't gone before, but I do think it's necessary to think differently and employ different strategies.
It's really fair. Julia, tell us about your programs.
And my focus is pretty narrow, I think, compared to others. I'm a treatment provider and came here to DC in 87. And because there was no funding at all, we just paid attention to what was helping the clients. And through kind of trial and error, determined the best course of treatment. And I think it was similar at the time maybe to Delancey Street out in San Francisco. And the average length of stay ended up being about a year or 2. We had resources there for getting a GED and things like that because you don't know where people have worked their way down or building themselves up. And so treatment involved a lot of just stabilizing, detoxing. And at the time, probably 25 years, nobody was on any kind of medication at all. And so you could just sort of automatically, within about 30 days, watch the light come on. And then there was a kind of organically out of the group of people just grew leadership. And then you had some very strict rules about structure that, you couldn't use and a couple other things. And it really was a beautiful thing. And then licensing came along. And then there was housing available, but nobody would move into it. And at the time, the big housing communities here, they liked us because they knew people were at least 6 months clean, maybe a year clean before they moved into their facilities. And so housing was not an issue because people were employable, began to get employed, were sober, and it just worked. And since then, there's been a lot of changes. COVID, I don't know what's been going on since COVID. But I really believe that no individual wants to sleep on a urine-soaked mattress, nobody in their right mind. And given the opportunity, on some level, everybody wants to change their life. Everybody. Nobody wants to live that way. And if they know there's a choice, and if they get to a place where they're clean, they're sober, and they're in an environment where they can look at other people getting better, they want to change. And that becomes contagious. So that's my focus. And just knowing that once that happens, people are able to, because people used to come in, you're going to be housing? No, you'll get your own housing. It just takes time. Because, it's pretty creative. It takes a lot of intelligence to be a drug addict out on the streets. And you just kind of use that skill once you get sober, and you can accomplish a lot. And it takes a lot of support and ongoing support. We still have alumni coming back 35, 40 years later, hiring them, and they're running other organizations and things like that. So I tend to have high expectations, and we tend to look at people. They have the ability to change their lives. So that's my end. Giving people the opportunity to have a life that's fabulous if that's what they want.
So that's great. I don't know how many of you sat in the federal funding workshop, but one of the speakers, I think it was David Gonzalez-Rice maybe, said something that really resonated with me. And he was sort of talking about the shift in federal focus away from permanent supportive housing to forced treatment, and the fact that there weren't accompanying investments in treatment really just is a focus on force, right? And I think that we are seeing the shift, and maybe in our space, because some of you are practitioners, you see it in a little bit of a different lens than other people. So I'm curious, how do you think the change in COC funding will play out in your communities, and what does it mean for some of the everyday work? And I don't know, Neal, if maybe you want to go first, and then Tramecia.
Sure. A friend of mine a while back and I were talking about a guy who he really didn't like. And he said, people aren't binary. I don't think this guy's all evil or all good, and none of us are. And I think that in these discussions, we kind of get sucked into a binary pathway. Like, either we're going to go all permanent supportive housing or transitional housing or using other buzzwords. But I think we have to think differently and recognize that whatever funding is available, we've got to, as practitioners, we got to help people, right? Mm-hmm. And we got to figure out how to do that within the systems that we're dealing with. And when you scratch the surface, sometimes those buzzwords don't mean all that much anyways, because permanent supportive housing in one place can be a little different than another. And in Houston, where we did take a permanent supportive housing route to yield a lot of success, we're now hitting this point where we have harder to serve individuals who that's not working for, right? And so another approach needs to be taken. And and I just spent time reviewing the civility ordinance the city passed and the legislation, Senate bill that was passed recently. And it's an interesting and I think helpful blend of compassion and law enforcement where it's needed. So there's, with the civility ordinance, you have counseling involved. It's not just, there's a big difference between, I used to hear horror stories about trying to clean up Skid Row in LA years ago where some police chief, would get upset with the problems and just go confiscate everybody's stuff and terrorize them and traumatize them and think they solved the problem. In 3 months, everybody's back because they didn't address the systemic issues. So that shouldn't ever be happening anywhere. But law enforcement, working with mental health professionals, with resources to help folks. One thing that Houston has done very successfully is decommissioned encampments in a really compassionate way. And we've had a 33%, we have closed over 127 encampments. And in each of those, there was a very compassionate methodology where folks went in and got to know the individuals there, to know their situations, told them what's coming, looked for housing options for them. And whether that's in a permanent supportive housing unit or a transitional housing unit, kind of doesn't matter in some cases. One may be better for one person and one better for the other. But the key was they found a way to find housing, to compassionately work with them and work with law enforcement over a period of weeks and then close down the encampment by moving folks into housing of some kind or another, and then working with Public Works to put fencing around the areas where the encampment was, and law enforcement to put up no trespassing signs and to close that access. But it was done very compassionately and in a really coordinated way. So, I mean, I think we are just going to, as practitioners, have to deal with the cards that were dealt and work with an open-minded approach to figuring out how to deploy those resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, I work in the space of veterans, and people always think the VA will provide everything for every veteran, which is not true. And we have a lot of continuum of care housing for veterans in San Francisco. So we operate about 500 units of housing in San Francisco alone for veterans, and about probably 100 or so units of that is continuum of care subsidized housing. So we're very concerned about what's going to happen if we have a loss of funding for that housing stock for veterans. And it's, I think just the uncertainty of it all is the challenge. I mean, when I first started doing this work, HUD was funding more transitional housing. And so that was the focus. And then it slowly moved its way from transitional to permanent housing. And so you see these shifts, but not really taking a look at we need all of the above. So we don't just need one type of housing. We do need an actual continuum from transitional, shelter, all the way through permanent housing and even beyond, because we do have a large aging population in the U.S. in general, right? Like, this is not a phenomenon only around veterans. Like, our population is aging. So how do we care for folks throughout that lifespan? And so I do think thinking about how do we make that continuum real? I think when we think about what VA does do for veterans, they've done a good job of building a continuum. So we do have transitional housing. We do have permanent housing. It is attached to healthcare. So it is a great model. And I think that's been one of the beauties of looking at the reduction in veteran homelessness is that system was funded. If you do not fund the system is not going to work. I mean, it's plain and simple. It's not magic. We have to have resources in a system to make a dent in any kind of number or to provide any type of meaningful resource. So I would just say the COC changes are real. They are still uncertain of where things will land. What does this mean? What localities will have to do to kind of backstop a lot of that housing? Because the reality is most communities don't want to see more people on their streets. So it's not incumbent upon local mayors, state governors, or, whatever the municipalities are to see those folks lose that housing. But what does that then do to a local budget? So it's not as if there's going to be more block grant money or something else to backstop. And we're talking millions of dollars just in San Francisco alone. So thinking about nationwide what that means, that is a lot of money that states and counties are going to have to come up with to figure out how to save this housing. And I don't know if everywhere can do that. And so what does that look like for folks who have been stable, who are now back in a position of potential homelessness that increases mental health symptoms? A lot of things come along with that. So it's bigger than the issue of housing. It's really about community. It's about stability. It's about family. So it really is a huge impact.
And I do think the wraparound services that are necessary, no matter what methodology you use, particularly for people with significant mental health problems, has always been the most tenuous part of this whole system. Mm-hmm. I remember persuading a great nonprofit in Houston called New Hope Housing when I was the housing director, like, hey, we want you to have PSH units, and a big component of that is the wraparound services. And she said, well, how can you guarantee to me that those services will continue to be funded for the next 15 years? And I said, honestly, I can't. We're subject to congressional appropriations, and we are. I mean, we have that vulnerability. But whatever methodology we use, whether it's transitional housing, PSH, those wraparound services are key. And when I was looking at the legislation passed in Texas, where they're talking about this more compassionate way of working with the continuum of care and law enforcement, they're focused also on providing the mental health services that are needed for people who have that, but there's no funding for it yet. And so this was legislation that just passed. Well, we got to have that funding, or we're all going to have serious problems.
I'm actually really happy you pivoted us that way, because I was just about to ask Julia what types of partnerships really have worked when you're serving civilians, right? Because I think in the veteran system, I wouldn't say we're flush with resources, but we have access to a lot more services and supports, right, than most folks do for civilians. And so, Julia, from your perspective, what types of cross-sector partnerships or services have proven most useful as you've been serving people?
Honestly?
Yeah, honestly. Or not honestly, I don't know what to you.
In 87, Mitch Snyder created this facility, Second and D, and it had medical services in there, and it had a shelter next door, and then the treatment program. So medical treatment downstairs, but we steered clear of any funding at all for probably 25 years until it became mandated. I don't know how we operated. I mean, but there was hardly any staff, and the success rate was pretty incredible. And when you said that, one of the best things that came along was Back on My Feet. And it was a running program.
I like that.
And they would come by, and then they would work with people. They'd deck them out in, shoes, tennis shoes and running gear. And so we'd run every day. They'd run into different presidents, whoever jogged at the time. But it was things like that, and things that just came about organically. And people would say, well, how can you afford to do that? Where'd you get the funding? It's like, we just did it. I mean, I didn't know better, or it probably wouldn't have happened. But we had, an acupuncturist come in, or a yoga, and you would just do these things, and the money would come. And the total focus was just on serving the population and having a medical facility downstairs for people with high blood pressure and things like that. And it was really cost effective. Again, licensing kicked in. I don't know how they're going to mandate treatment. It would be, again, I don't think anybody in their right mind wants to live the way they're living. And also, I think in the district, for the most part, there's very, very little support these days for residential treatment. Almost everybody's been put out of business with all this complicated stuff that's going on. So it would be nice to get some help. But we've never relied on government funding until recently. And it's just, honestly, it's been a nightmare. So hopefully we continue to do good work and continue to serve the population and not be in servitude to a lot of organizations that aren't helping.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to pivot a little bit and ask a question, because we've been talking a lot about permanent supportive housing and what happens if the funding goes away for that, right? But it is a lot of work once you put somebody in housing to keep them in that placement, right? And so I'm curious from your perspectives, and I will let anybody chime in who wants to, right? Like, what are some of the challenges? How long do folks normally stay in the units? And sort of what kind of responses you need when people aren't employable or when they're sort of decompensating?
Have all eyes. Okay. I am a licensed clinician as well. So to me, like, the work starts when you get somebody in housing. That is not like the end. Like, that is the beginning of a new chapter, right? So all the things that folks did not want to address, did not want to see, did not want to touch, it comes out in permanent housing. So we operate housing with on-site case management. And so often people will come in and we're trying to get you connected to healthcare. Have you had a primary care visit? What's going on with, this, that, the other, right? Like, it's a number of things. And so we tend to see people get worse before they get better, because they find out about all the things they weren't addressing when they were living on the streets that they're now interacting with and getting stable medical care. So you see that shift. And I think the biggest thing, to Neal's point, is the unfunded services. So we do these services, but how do we pay for the quality of services that we truly need? I have been doing this for over 15 years at Swords. And so from when I started to now, there is a very different need of folks who are coming through our doors in our housing. So we worked with the state to fund a pilot across California for veterans in permanent supportive housing to actually provide supportive services in permanent supportive housing. So that looked like transportation services, that looked like on-site clinicians, that looked like additional in-home support services, peer support staffing, a number of staff that you really need to operate these programs and to do so successfully. And we've seen reduced emergency room visits, reduced substance use, higher engagement in community. So all of these things that we're like, yes, we knew this would happen if we had the people to actually engage with the folks that we're housing And so how do you scale that? How do you think about that for permanent supportive housing across the spectrum, veteran or not? What are we thinking about, how we make sure people eat? How do we make sure people are having reminders to take medication? It's often the little things that people overlook in terms of housing quality for folks, but you need staff to do that. And so often you can find a subsidy, or you can find a subsidy for 5 years or maybe 2 or 3 years. But the hardest thing to fund typically are support services. Yet we all know it's required. If the process for bringing folks into housing, or you're serving the most vulnerable people in your communities, you don't just put them in a room and hope for the best, right?
No.
Like that is a recipe for disaster, and we know that. So really looking at how we fund these housing sites, whether it's mixed use and you have some deeply affordable units integrated within other income statuses, great. The whole community benefits. We have one site that's mixed with families and veterans. Everybody benefits. We see veterans reading to kids who are living in the family units. It just builds so much community. And when you think about the intergenerational impact across folks who are formerly homeless, working with folks who've never been homeless, after a few years, you don't see a difference. And so I think that for us was also key, is that you can bring people back to a place where they feel like they're a part of their community and that they can give back, and they're not seen as an other. They're not seen as formerly homeless or somebody with an addiction or, all of these other things. So housing provides dignity to folks. And so the very people that you may be thinking they are never going to make it, they often surprise you. So I do think we have to figure out a way how to scale what we do and to do it well, because otherwise we'll continue to have these stories of it's too expensive, it doesn't work. And it's it's not going to work if you don't fund it.
Well, I was talking to a friend who's one of my kind of heroes in this reducing homelessness ecosystem the other day. And she was making the point that, if you have to look at things system-wide, and that was one of the things that we really did comprehensively in Houston, was looked at every piece of the system. We went to nonprofits who'd been doing things the same way for decades, and we said, you got to change. And if you don't, you're not going to get funded. And a lot of them didn't like it, right? But ultimately they changed. And, we didn't ask them to do idiotic things. There were things that made sense to work better with the system, because we'd created a system that was most convenient for the service providers, but really inconvenient for the individuals who had to access their services, right? So you got to think through the whole process. I'm kind of a process systems guy. And my friend was pointing out just the other day, some people seem to think that if you just take people with severe mental illness and just get a bed, get a shelter, someplace to put them, that's going to solve the problem. Just get them into a bed. Well, she said that's analogous to thinking that if you have an emergency room that's full in a hospital, that the answer to resolving that problem is to add another emergency room so that more people can wait. No, you need more doctors and medical help, medical professionals to solve the problems of the people in the waiting room so that they get the comprehensive help they need and they get out of the waiting room and somebody else comes in. So we're trying to look at ways to provide those intensive mental health services for those that need it and do it more rapidly so that when we have shelter beds or transitional housing beds, whatever available, that we could move 5 people through that in a year instead of 2. And so we have to meet that challenge of providing. I don't know who the idiots were who thought decades ago that it's a great idea to just take severely mentally ill people and just leave them on the streets to wander around and think that they're going to be okay. It just boggles my mind that society has that we got there ever. But if we want to move away from that, we have to have the resources to be able to give folks the treatment they need.
Gotcha.
And just to add that, I'm all for housing. And over the years, a lot of residents that go into supportive housing, they're faced with people around them in active addiction. And people in active addiction, it's dangerous and it's not safe. As you said, there's been murders. And so I think we should also be cognizant of people who are wanting to stay clean and sober and change their life, that we offer safe living for them as well. And that they not have someone smoking crack living next door to them. Crack addicts don't make good neighbors. because that's been one of the problems. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can, we can serve a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. But it takes time and involvement and more than medication. It's just rampant in every way, shape, and form. And we're just not talking to people anymore and dealing with just that early trauma, whether it's PTSD or these horrific childhoods. But that's just across the board with everybody. So hopefully, and it takes time. It takes time.
So I'm going to pivot us to audience questions because I have a handful here in the app. I hope folks in the room will feel free to ask questions either via the app or raise your hand. But since I do have some, I'm going to ask this first question because I do think it's interesting. It's from Richard Southey. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He wants to know, how can providers be encouraged to embrace and explore innovative and sustainable solutions when the broader climate seems to encourage risk-averse program decision-making?
Wow.
That seems like a question for Neal.
Yes, very deep.
Oh, really? That's a good question. There are a lot of assumptions in there to unpack, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think sometimes these labels and buzzwords that we associate with the different methodologies sometimes are just they're almost not helpful because they're so shallow. And so maybe part of the answer is explaining in applications for funding and how you're working this. And I'm a lawyer, is sometimes it's all in how you say it and how you phrase what you're doing. And maybe we need to find ways to articulate what we're doing without buzzwords and with the meat there so that we can help people see that maybe there's not as much difference in some of these methodologies as they think. I mean, it's a bummer when these things get politicized and people think, well, this methodology is for all the folks on the right and this is for all the folks on the left, when that's just a bunch of malarkey. It's baloney. It just doesn't hold water, right? So I think we may just have to explain ourselves using different language that doesn't cause people to freak out unnecessarily. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's all I got for now. Off the cuff.
I mean, I think I would just add, one of the things that I find very helpful, I think to your point, Neal, is to just talk about the needs of the people that we serve, right? And thinking about the fact that people should not be on the streets. People deserve housing. People deserve healthcare. And, talking about how to build community, what would it take to have, a country where folks did not have to consider life on the streets or in a car or hidden homelessness in hotels and different things. And so really, I think speaking to the needs of your community in whatever language that looks like, because I think some of the things we think are risk-taking is basic things. How do we make sure people have food to eat beyond one hot meal a day if they can get that, right? Not making a decision of paying for medication or paying your rent. How do we kind of think about some of those things? And I'm anti-pilot commission study of things we know work, right? We don't need another pilot to figure out that people need deeply affordable housing, so they're not spending 70% of their income to rent. So, I mean, just, how do we frame these conversations in ways that maybe I don't even know if offend is the right word, but shut down the conversation? Because I think that's the bigger issue, right? Is how do you keep people engaged and listening and not completely shut it down because we've come to you talking about DEI, or we've come to you to, all of these things where people have ideas about what that means, or housing first, or some of these terms that we use that do have proven methods behind them, but people have an image of what that is that can be unhelpful to the conversation.
And sometimes to that end, find points of agreement. If somebody who thinks that housing first is a crazy idea and believes there's no accountability in that, comes to you and says it is wrong for us to have people just living on the streets and for us to not do something about it. You're right. It is wrong. I agree with you. Let's talk about how to change that. We live in such a polarized era that anything that we can do to find common ground and work with one another and not assume the worst in other folks that are approaching you, If I didn't know all of what I know about a lot of different methodologies, I might think very differently if I was just approached at first blush about some of the stuff. When I was a real estate finance guy, and the mayor said, I want you to solve homelessness in Houston. I'm like, I don't know anything about that, right? And so I went and found people who did know a lot about it and asked them to get involved, and we got a big, broad coalition. But initially, I thought the whole idea of housing first sounded crazy. It's like, really? You just put somebody right in an apartment? And then you look at the data and you say, well, it works. But other methodologies work too. And so just having grace for folks who are coming from a different perspective and then sitting down and talking to them. I agree with you too. For me, the prime directive has always been, in all my work, is focus on the needs of the human beings, God's children who are suffering, right? And who are who are paying too much for their rent, or who need a quality, affordable housing, who need to get off the street. And I do find that both sides may look at things differently, but most of the folks on both sides are good people who are trying to help those individuals that we all care about. And I think we need to be a little bit more open about how we view some of the buzzwords and view each other when we have these discussions. Maybe that will help.
Well, Julia, what do you think? Because you're pretty innovative. You didn't take any federal funding for a long time, so you got a little bit of expertise here.
I think we need to have higher expectations of the people that we serve. Honestly, when there was no staff and people were able to pull together, leadership evolved organically, and the wisdom of the group kind of evolved, and within a certain structure. And there had to be really strict rules in terms of like no violence, no using, that sort of thing. And then the spirit just kind of evolved there. And when you have so much staff, which is so expensive, the reason I think residential treatment is getting in trouble is because they've made it so expensive. And everybody's in a role of really trying to help somebody. And the good ones really know about how to empower someone else and how you can create a structure where people are doing it themselves and feeling like they accomplished something. And that's a skill. And not all counselors, therapists, providers have that. Mm-hmm. Churches. That's the work. And it's realized. And I think if we begin to look at folks that way, because people will come in, it's like, well, I have mental. Okay, well, whatever. And you speak to that part of them that is whole. And I've seen thousands of people, and probably out of thousands, maybe one or two, it's like, they're not there. But that's, a very small number. And so it's figuring out a structure that really empowers people, and it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it takes time. But it's trusting in the wisdom of that individual with other individuals, hopefully having some sort of system to where they can look up to other people, and then it becomes that. That's kind of my take on it.
Okay. So we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to go with one last question, but I'm going to ask each of you to be very brief. This is a question from the online audience who noted that, Tramecia, you mentioned the growth in older adults experiencing homelessness. And this person is wondering, how are each of your organizations working with areas, agencies on aging and or organizations that provide home and community-based services to address functional needs? Literally like 1 minute or less, please.
Okay. So yes, even though we serve veterans, we do work with local aging providers. I would say in the veteran world, it's a little different because we're finding out about all the things veterans don't qualify for if they have VA healthcare. Of course, you can pair VA healthcare, Medicare, but for extremely low-income veterans, how do we pair VA, Medicare, VA and Medicaid, in California it's Medi-Cal, Medicaid, and to bring in those additional in-home support services or whatever supports folks will need to age in place. I would say the pilot that we're doing, the reason I think it works spectacularly is because these are staff of the nonprofit. So we can move that staff around, we can be nimble, we can use them where we need them. They're not serving every person within our population. It's about 10 to 15% of folks who need that care. But that's very different than working on a by-patient process in terms of this person has access to these services and funding, this person does not. We get to decide how those services are utilized and use them when people need them. So it's definitely much more efficient and effective. And it's a roving team across a number of buildings. So I do think there is a world in which we have to think about like the Medicaid waivers and how they work, but also the practicality for a nonprofit implementing these processes on a by-patient level when we're talking about communities. So I think our frames are different coming from the community versus a healthcare perspective, but we do partner with aging providers, and there's still that gap, especially for significantly low-income folks who just don't have the means to afford the care they really need.
Okay. 1 minute.
In Houston, we are developing more really high-quality, affordable housing for seniors. That's the answer. And one of our great nonprofits, I just referenced, New Hope Housing, does a really beautiful job of the architectural design in their projects. They're just stunning, right? And which doesn't necessarily cost more. And then they'll work with philanthropy to make things just a little better. They'll have a stained glass window or art out in the front. And there's something about beautiful buildings that lifts the human spirit. And I think doing a little bit extra on our affordable housing developments to make them just really beautiful is really important. It sends a message to the people who live there that you're important and, you're revered and we care about you, rather than just boxes that warehouse people who are struggling economically. So that's our focus.
Christ House in the district is wonderful. They take men in, they don't take women. And there's a couple of senior facilities that are good, but it's hard, because older people will come into treatment and we'll keep them. I mean, we keep people as long as they're working on themselves. But when they have a lot of physical problems, again, Christ House is a good organization, but we could use a lot more like that.
Gotcha. So for folks who don't know, Christ House they do medical respite, right?
Yes. So they get their own apartment. They have their own housing complex, and they work with insurance and that sort of thing, people on disability.
Gotcha.
And they continue with the medical care. I mean, Dr. Getch just passed away a couple of years ago. She was still working at 80.
Wow.
Coming in and helping people.
That's amazing.
But it was, we need more of that. So.
All right. Well, so as we wind down, I want to give each of you a chance to have 30 seconds to tell everybody the last thing that they should walk away with. If you're leaving this workshop, what is the one thing that you want them to know about homelessness as they go out into the world? And I'll let anyone who wants to go first go first.
I think I've already said enough.
Hey, okay.
I think.
I would say it is solvable in that people matter. I think we need to bring humanity back to the folks that are on the streets or in our programs, and just have a level of care for each other, and regardless of where we find ourselves in life.
I would echo that. I mean, we need to focus on the needs of the individuals, the real people whose lives are being negatively affected. But I think it's critically important to look at the whole systems that you have to help those folks and not be myopic and just look at it in a piecemeal manner. But to create real change, you need hyper crazy level of coordination and cooperation between the different sectors involved in the system to make the most impactful change.
Okay, that's fair. I guess my 30-second thing is everyone can do something, right? Whether you're a part of the system or not. There are things that you can do as an individual to help people who are experiencing homelessness. And I hope that each of you does at least one by Christmas, maybe by the end of the year. With that, I would like to thank our brilliant panel. I would like to thank all of you for being here and online. And I'd like to thank our panel sponsors, Pretium, for putting this on today.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.